Hey, it's Michael Hallman, Leadership Network's Code for the Kingdom. And man, I'm so happy to have on the line two great individuals, John Engbrecht and Julie Wright. They are with Grace Church in Minneapolis, and they're doing some phenomenal things. Thank you two so much for joining us today. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Our
Well,
pleasure.
man, we were talking earlier, and it kind of just falls in line with everything that Code for the Kingdom stands for, about this conversation as to how technology and faith come together. John, you and I had you had some really keen things to say about that. You want to kind of pick up where we talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my background, I've been an engineer and actually a youth pastor for a number of years. And I just love to see how technology can work with faith and in the kingdom. And just to even help people understand a little bit about how these things blend together, I usually like to break it down into four simple areas. The first is technology can be used for just administrative efficiencies within the church. We were talking briefly about like an e-bulletin system, right? And how just even something as simple as an automated or electronic way to get your bulletins in church could potentially save even Grace Church $30,000 a year in printing costs every year. There's some other ways that it can be used. Communication, I feel like technology, especially with smartphones and tablets and the internet, has completely changed the way that we communicate, that we interact with each other, that we present information, receive information. And if you think about the gospel and what the church's message is, it's all about communication, about truth, about relationships. And so we can use technology to foster that within the kingdom community. Another way that we can use technology is humanitarian outreach. You have people all over the world, right, who are hurting, it's in poverty, they don't have clean drinking water, they don't have a good place to stay. And there's great ways with technology that, people have designed, water filters, for dollars that basically give clean drinking water to people for pennies that literally saves their life from disease and bacteria. And then there's also apologetics. One of the biggest things that we see in this generation is that people are coming against it, with the evolution and creation basically saying that faith isn't real from a scientific perspective, that science basically disproves faith. And I don't believe that, and I believe that there's a lot of evidence, but it needs to be presented, more study needs to be done, more investigation. So those are just ways where science and faith really kind of blend, especially technology, and they really can work together.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a positive way for the kingdom.
Absolutely. Julie, in your role there at the church, you're involved pretty heavily in evangelism, in outreach, and I imagine that you have seen some benefits of technology as well. What are your thoughts on that?
I think technology, as I shared earlier, is just a tool that can accelerate and advance the kingdom and outreach and evangelism unlike anything we've ever seen in previous generations. I look at the power of it, the ability to resource and reach into people's homes, neighborhoods, places in the world that still don't have a gospel witness. Kids, even impoverished kids, have phones. It's pretty amazing. You can go into an impoverished neighborhood, they still are on their cell phone. And with that technology coming, if you can access that, you can bring the gospel into the homes of children that are never going to set foot in our church. They're not going to come to church. We need to take the gospel to where the children are. So I've been doing that for the last 20 years, going to where the children are, because if the gospel doesn't go to them, they're not going to get it. And one of the things that I've seen in this generation, in the upcoming generation, is that technology is a tool that can get in front of multitudes of children, especially if you can mobilize and get their peers activated. Peer-to-peer evangelism is the most effective evangelism there is.
Absolutely. So you two have come together to work on a project to kind of streamline the technology and how it's unleashed in society, both right there in the Minneapolis area, but also globally.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah. So the idea basically came. So I'm an engineer by trade, electrical engineer. Done a lot of software work in my life, mostly in R&D. And one day it just dawned on me, when you think about using your gifts to serve Christ, most of the time in a church setting, there isn't always the opportunity for somebody with an engineering or science background to really use their gifts. I mean, these are the people that created the internet, that cancer-fighting drugs, spaceships. I mean, the list goes on.
Right.
Those gifts and talents aren't utilized generally in the church to the degree. We talked earlier a little bit about how usually people with those backgrounds end up serving, by updating the church website or running the soundboard. And so the thought was, could you engage people that have that passion for Christ to use those gifts for the kingdom? And so just as we were talking, one of the things, the heart of this ministry is we bring on 1 or 2 people, but the goal is to be able to build these things. You can't do with 1 or 2 people, but if you can activate people on a volunteer basis, this isn't a nonprofit, right? This isn't, we're trying to, start a company. It's how do we engage the local church, right, to do these things. And so we talk, if I could recruit 50 people out of the 3 million people in the Twin Cities area for 8-hour-a-week commitment, to use their gifts to serve in the kingdom, which is pretty standard for a lot of church service opportunities, like consistent, regular ones. It's equivalent to almost $1 million yearly annual R&D budget to help the kingdom.
Wow.
And produce these tools that can then take any other funding that people bring in for the kingdom and just multiply it. We were talking a little bit before too about how some of these people in these foreign countries, these pastors, we were just in Liberia, they don't have teaching, they don't have training, they don't have materials, they don't have books. But for $50, I can get a 7-inch wholesale Android tablet from China, and I can upload a 4-year seminary degree with a $15 solar charger and a nice little case. And so for $100, I can actually give a Liberian pastor an entire 4-year seminary degree. And all that can be built just using people's volunteer and their heart to use their God-given gifts to serve the kingdom.
Right, right. In fact, Julie, there are 3 areas that you all are trying to tackle, and that's just one of them. Can you tell us a little bit more about the other areas?
Sure. So the one Jonathan just mentioned had to do with building a repository of Christian resources for the urban and the global church that is under-resourced. We see that all over, and our church, just this church alone, is full of resources that if we could just get them in a format, whether it's a tablet on the ground or even something on the web that is downloadable on people's smartphones and cell phones around the world, you could literally resource huge portions of the global church overnight by building a repository. So that was one. The second one is next generation tools and technology. We have a few different projects, both to disciple the next generation. We have one that's also meant to release and activate the next generation called Great Commission Kids, which is using a collaboration of some organizations like Awana, Compassion International, and some others that have come to the table in the 414 movement to build a single tool that all these organizations can use to activate the next generation and do that kind of as one voice. One of the things we talked about with all these groups that work with the next generation, we all got fired up at this global summit for the 414, and our discussion was we can go home to our respective ministries and churches and just basically turn up the volume. So Awana can turn up the volume on Awana, Compassion can turn up the volume, and as we all turn up the volume, what the church is going to hear in the pew, in the congregation, is more noise. Where if we can come together and collaborate and say we're going to build something that encompasses all our areas of expertise, so the prayer ministry people will help build and speak into the content for a prayer component, discipleship groups can help with discipleship, evangelism groups with evangelism, service groups with service, and we can collaborate that and come to the table and build a tool that all of us can use. What the congregation, what the people in the church will hear is they will get a message that the next generation can be discipled and then released to reach their own generation.
Absolutely.
So that, So that was the second one. And then the third one had to do with some of these things that help, strategies to help mobilize the church, like a clearinghouse. So I've been in missions for 20 some years. I go to Odessa, Ukraine. I've never been able to find out who else is working in Odessa, Ukraine. I'd love to have a place where I could click on a country or a city or a type of ministry and just find out who else is doing it. So we just went to Liberia. I'd love to just click Liberia and find out who's in Liberia.
Wow.
But instead, you got to go to Liberia or dig through huge websites to dig down into their national directors, find contact information, And it turns out Samaritan's Purse is in Liberia, Living Water, Orphan Relief and Rescue, SIM. And luckily, we've run into all those people. But it would have been great if that didn't take 14 years for me to discover that the guy 3 houses down is also a missionary, and we could have partnered 14 years ago.
Yeah.
So one of those, there's just a lot of efficiencies for the gospel and for ministry that can rapidly advance the gospel by using technology to help coordinate the efforts in the kingdom.
Definitely. So these are kind of looking ahead at a lot of things that you're trying to create. But Jonathan, if I'm correct, you've actually already created something. At the first Code for the Kingdom last year in San Francisco, you actually created an app that does have tremendous potential. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we did a prototype, and since then we've done some requirements and kind of refined the concept. It's not finished yet, but the idea is very simple. It's how do you kids today spend 7 to 8 hours a day involved and engaged in some kind of media, whether it's playing Flappy Bird or videos or music or television or some Call of Duty, whatever it is, right? And so how do you redeem that? And so one of the things that I was looking at was throughout Scripture, God basically takes physical things to remind us of spiritual truth. So in the Old Testament, you can think about how he set up stones or memorials or different things that reminded the people that God had done something. With Abraham, he said, your descendants will be like the stars and like the sand, so that every time Abraham, both night and day, saw the sand, he saw the stars, he was reminded of God's promise. And so how do you take that biblical concept and kind of weave it into today's society? Well, it's a little bit ridiculous to carry around a backpack full of rocks that remind you of all the great things that God has done. But that's where technology comes in. And so, today, with things like Facebook, we have pictures and memories. But what if you could actually extend those data types and say, look, what if we had stones? And stones is basically a data type that says, here's a picture and a description of what happened and maybe some metadata about the type of event, maybe some audio, tag some friends in it and say, this is a stone, this is a memorial, a digital memorial of something that God did in my life. Or maybe it's a picture of something, of a promise that God has. God, you feel like God is calling you somewhere. And when that promise is fulfilled, it actually becomes a stone, right? It's a memorial. And so what's beautiful about this is that so many times in our life when we get in these struggles and these difficult situations, we get our blinders on and all we can see is the problem in front of us. But God wants to remind us of all the good things that he's done in our past to encourage us. And so this is a great way where we can go back and review. You can get daily notifications and pushes that says, remember this moment. And when you see that picture, all of a sudden, just like, in the Old Testament, when they saw the stones, they were reminded of the great thing that God did in their life. And what's even more exciting is not just personal faith building, but I can share these things and other people, friends can see them. And when they see them, they look, what is that? And it's like, well, this is when God did this awesome thing in my life. And it can open up even an evangelistic conversation with an unbeliever, where they can even look at these things without even a conversation, right? And they can start to see the great things that God's done in your life. So that's just a very simple way of redeeming existing social technology to incorporate our faith in it.
Yeah, that was a very powerful app that came out of that first hackathon, man. There were many apps that were created over that weekend, but that was definitely one of the more powerful ones, man. And I'm hoping to see you all again at the next hackathon if possible.
Yeah. We're hoping.
Well, yeah, we're even hoping to have one here. I mean, if this thing takes off, we would love to have a hackathon in the Twin Cities.
Yeah. Absolutely, man. Absolutely.
So, go ahead.
No. So one of the things,
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Too?
Go ahead.
One of the other things that we've developed that we forgot to talk about earlier was Jonathan and I worked on storyboarding the video for the North American 414 movement. And so we had storyboarded this about reaching the next generation, the video, and Compassion International found out about it, read through the content, and donated over $50,000 to produce that video, was what they believed in the messaging of it. And so that has been produced, and I just learned that Billy Graham, their national convention, used that video in their evangelistic national convention this past year. And so that was another one we did just at the kitchen table, Kind of like, what does the Bible say about this? We know we need to reach the next generation. We know we need to help churches reach the next generation and capitalize on that 4% and that 80% that I told you about. And that video is what came out of that.
So as we look ahead to, how we create technology, how we mobilize individuals who are capable of creating that technology, you all recognize that it's very difficult to do that, kind of on nights and weekends. And so you've proposed a pretty interesting idea to the elder board at your church. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so really the idea is is very simple. So we want to take 1 or 2 people and bring them on staff. And because, like you said, it's really hard for somebody on their own to run a project.
Yeah.
But if I can have somebody who's full-time invested in it, I can farm out small pieces to different people to work on here and there, or have collaboration sessions, or maybe like a weekend, we get together and we just work and we develop something. Mm-hmm. But again, that whole idea that if you can even mobilize, like I said, 50 people in the local Twin Cities area to donate some of their time, with somebody kind of running and leading and guiding the charge with that, there's some awesome things you can do. Another thing that we've talked about as well to kind of make that happen is if there are particular projects that need funding and we can't do it on a volunteer basis, there's nothing that says we can't go and talk with the people in our church who have a heart for this, who have been blessed with the financial ability to give. And say, look, this is they're businessmen, right? That's where they made their money. Look, here's the return on investment. If you'll fund $200,000 worth of software development, or to build this thing, or to buy 1,000 tablets, to give 1,000 pastors in a foreign country, right? An entire seminary degree worth of education. Those are some other ways that we can do it, because right now, they're investing in things within the kingdom, but what we want to do is we want to take that funds that they're already giving and we want to multiply them. And so by having them invest not just in giving just resources financially like clothes and food and water, but if we can actually design and build things that then take all future investments and just make them that much more effective.
Yeah.
That's another way that we looked at potentially funding, because there are people within our church that have those that gift from God to give in those ways.
That's cool. That's quality, man. So Julie, you had something you were going to say?
Yeah, from a ministry perspective, which is kind of the angle that I bring to the table here, less than the technology, except I see the power and the potential of it, as I talk to organizations, the church and the body of Christ, nonprofits, all these other groups, one of the things they have come back and shared with us as the local church owning a ministry like this, like Compassion, huge group. They have technology, they have an ad agency, all these things, but they're Compassion International. So everything they do is for the sake of Compassion. And you have other groups over here, Awana's over here, and what they do is for the sake of Awana. And actually those two organizations met on a day before they met us, and they laughed because they're like, have you heard of Grace Church and this project they're trying to work on called Great Commission Kids? And they said before that, there was kind of the heads of those two organizations, and they were kind of doing the organizational dance to try to partner. Like, well, we'll partner, but who pays for it? Is it going to promote Compassion or Awana?
Right.
The organizational dance, because they have kind of, quote, a horse in the race. And when we met with them after that meeting, one of the comments they made when they looked at us and said, as the local church, they said, you guys are like Switzerland. You're the Switzerland. They're like, you don't have a horse in the race. You guys can sit as that hub and invite people to the table.
Wow.
And get organizations to contribute, because there isn't that who's gonna be the biggest boy on the block when it's all said and done. So we were actually invited by several of those large organizations to play that role, to be that project management hub in the middle of some of these technology tools for the next generation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because that brings out a very interesting point. So, as you all move forward into this project, how do you see partnerships with other local churches happening?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's exciting. I think one concept we had just to kick the whole thing off would be having like a hackathon here in the Twin Cities area, and just getting a whole bunch of people from local churches and then saying, look, we're going to be doing this thing on a regular basis, on a volunteer basis, and you're welcome to come and join. But we actually, here at Grace, we have a number of partnerships, even with local churches in the community already. We already do things together. Like we have like I said, I'm in youth ministry, and so we do things with other churches in terms of like youth ministry events and gatherings. And I think here there's actually a fair bit of openness, especially with the fact that we're not intending to like own this in the sense of like we want to make a whole bunch of money off it and we want to start a nonprofit. We want to get volunteers together who have a passion to serve for Christ, and we want to take the things that are produced, and if we produce a tablet app that can teach pastors in Liberia, we'll go down the street and say, Bethlehem, you had a couple guys that worked on this, or any church, even if you didn't have a couple guys that worked on this, you can buy this, right? Like, or you can take the software and install it on your own tablet, and you can give it to the missionaries, right, in the countries that you serve in. So I think because that open-handed nature of what we're trying to do, because it's not tied to an organization per se, in terms of like a nonprofit, like Julie said, has a horse in the race. I think there's a very willing openness, to do that. In fact, there's even a local church that we met with who said, "Look, I have half a dozen guys in my church, and we're in. As soon as this starts, like we want to work together. In fact, we're almost willing to give some funding to help pay for whoever's salary it is that heads this up."
Wow.
Our church is willing to potentially contribute to that.
That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. Well, you all have a huge task ahead of you, but it's definitely an honorable task. I'd like to kind of close things out with just asking you, how can we pray for you?
I would say, the biggest thing is always wisdom. It's wisdom and favor. As we think about this is, people have been, starting with nonprofit and for-profit companies and things like Code for the Kingdom hackathons, which are awesome. But this is kind of trying to take it to a new place where it's actually founded in the local church. And it's a kind of a new concept, right? I mean, you've seen churches kind of dabble with it a little bit, but not to this kind of a degree. And so because it's something new, I think it's always wisdom, right? How do we do this? Because there's not necessarily a good model. We're actually trying to create a good model for how this works. So that's my heart. And I guess the other thing would just be, that favor that other people catch that vision, that it's a God-inspired vision, that God would lead us and guide us and direct us in it, and that all of it would be, for kingdom advancement, for His glory, and more than anything, that the people that are involved would get a chance to truly use their God-given gifts and talents to serve Him in a way that they hadn't before. Those are my prayers.
Gotcha. Julie, anything?
And, besides those, because those are really good, to expand on them, my heart's prayer for several years has just been this open-handed surrender of, Lord, I don't want anything unless you want it. And I've started to pray for God's kingdom to come and His will to be done. And it's like, whatever is for the kingdom. And so praying for provision for that. And then a big prayer of my heart is for protection. Because I've been around long enough to know that when something is being birthed, the enemy goes after the baby. And I know that. Indeed. He goes after a ministry when it's vulnerable, not when it's strong. And so that protection of people's motives and anything like this. You could start to build something and all of a sudden it could be like, hey, I know we were going to give this away for free, but, you could make a lot of money if you just, just protection from the ways that Satan may try to hijack, derail, or sabotage it. So as we go forward, I know in my heart the Lord's going to provide for it, and I'm just praying also for protection so that what God intends to happen through this is what happens.
We'll definitely be praying for you in this endeavor, knowing that God is going to see it through. John and Julie, it's been great talking with you all. Thanks so much for your time, and we'll definitely do a follow-up and keep in touch with you all.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Okay, you too. Thanks.